Welcome, and thank you for joining us. My name is Lori McClure, and I'm delighted to have Grammy Award-winning artist Laura Story Elvington with us today. Laura is author of a new book and Bible study called When God Doesn't Fix It, Lessons You Never Wanted to Learn, Truths You Can't Live Without. In case you haven't met her already, Laura Story's voice you already know from the hit song Blessings, which received a Grammy Award for the Best Contemporary Christian Music Song and Billboard Music Award for Top Christian Song, and her writing talent from the most popular worship song, Indescribable, which was recorded by Chris Tomlin. Laura is worship leader at Perimeter Church in Atlanta, Georgia, and she's wife to Martin and mom to Josie and twins Ben and Griffin. Welcome, Laura. We are so happy to have you join us today.
Hey, Lori, thanks so much for having me today. Really is my privilege.
What a treat for us. Before we begin, I want to invite all of you to join our conversation in the chat right below this video. If you haven't picked up your resources yet for our online Bible study, we hope that you've signed up. But you can go to store.faithgateway.com and get $4 off the book, the study guide, or the DVD with coupon code LAURA4, L-A-U-R-A 4. Thanks so much for joining us. We hope that you have registered already. If not, you can do that today. All right, so I wanted to just jump right in and ask you about your book. As a worship leader, you wouldn't think you would necessarily be an author, so what prompted you to write When God Doesn't Fix It?
That is a great question, because as a worship leader, I am so much more comfortable being a worship leader. And so the idea to write this book came from, every time I get to go out and do events, whether it's within my church, at Perimeter, or outside, I always find myself having these conversations with people about kind of our life story, what my husband and I have walked through with his help, as well as their stories. And the more I found that there was really something healing about both sharing my story and also engaging with other people in their stories, it really led me to want to tell the story in its entirety in the book. And as someone who has always loved Bible study and been involved in Bible study, doing a companion Bible study was always something I had in mind. Because I don't think it's just about me telling my story or even other people telling their stories, but the fact that our stories all point to that greater story of redemption.
I love the way you did that, by the way. These are our materials right here. I love that you put your story in the context of God's story. I think that's so valuable for us as Christians to relate not just in our own suffering, but to put it against the filter of God's grand story. I love the way you did that.
Well, I think a lot of people, they struggle to find purpose for, their particular story, and a lot of it is because we're looking for just that. We're looking to understand our story as this one life, without a context. But when you understand more of what the Bible says about our lives and the purpose for our lives and God's greater story of redemption, that's where our stories find purpose, and not just the good parts of our story. The scriptures tell us that God is a redeemer, and he's not just redeeming people, but he's redeeming all things. I'll tell you, it was life transforming for me to begin to understand that God is the redeemer of every ingredient in my life, whether it's past sin, whether it's current husband's disabilities, whatever it is. God can redeem every piece and use all of it for a purpose.
That's so true. It's an amazing truth. All right, so let's back up a little bit. Before life got a little bit broken, can you tell us what was your life like in your first year of marriage to Martin?
Well, so Martin and I met in high school, and so we had been high school sweethearts that got reconnected after college, and we initially met at a Fellowship of Christian Athletes event, which is kind of hilarious since I am not an athlete in any way and never have been. But they were having a cookout, and I think I went probably just wanting to fellowship with a good-looking Christian athlete, which ended up working for me. Worked out pretty well, but it was years after that we ended up getting married, and our first year it was just like honeymoon. We lived in this tiny little house. We were doing college ministry on campus of Wofford College, and everything was wonderful. I mean, don't get me wrong. Our house, we lived in this house that cost, I think it was $46,000. It was like this old crack house that we're like, to us, it was a mansion because we were together, we were doing ministry, and life seemingly was perfect. And Martin began to kind of experience just some funny symptoms. He would be lethargic and a little bit forgetful, and it probably took about 9 months to a year to really get to the bottom of what was going on, and he ended up being diagnosed with a brain tumor.
Oh my goodness. In that meantime, during that 9 months to a year, what was the stress and strain level on both you and Martin?
Wow, I'll tell you, it's hard to even describe. Martin was such a go-getter in high school and in college, and he was always we were kind of a funny pair because he was the straight-A student and I was just the goof off that skipped class, and I'm still amazed that they even passed me. But Martin had always been so reliable, and all of a sudden he's forgetting to show up for things. And he'd always been such a hard worker, but I couldn't get him to even be motivated to, to unload the dishwasher or just do normal household stuff. So I was caught between, and everyone says, when you get married, the honeymoon season comes to an end, and you can't expect this guy to be perfect. And I thought, yeah, but he is so different than the guy that I grew up knowing and the guy that I had been engaged to, and so it's hard to explain it, but in a lot of ways for both of us, it was such a relief to find out that there was something medically wrong, because for a while we just kind of both thought we were losing our minds.
So tell us about that day when you actually got a solid diagnosis.
Yes, I actually was out of town at a worship conference, and I remember sitting in this session listening to a teacher talking about worship, and ironically talking about how whatever you do as a worship leader and whatever you do even just as a worshiper in general, always put your family first. And I just thought, yeah, absolutely, put family first. That's great. And I remember seeing the missed call from Martin, and he had a follow-up doctor appointment where they thought that there might be something wrong with some of his thyroid maybe, and so he was seeing an endocrinologist, but tumor wasn't anywhere on our radar. So I remember seeing the missed call. We hopped in the car, just my coworkers and I hopped in the car to go get lunch, and I was there in that Panera parking lot that I remember calling him back and saying, "What's up?" And he said, "Well, I went to the doctor and I have a brain tumor." And I was thinking maybe some low hormone levels. I mean, it just wasn't even on our radar. And I remember thinking, okay, I was crying a little bit, and I thought, okay, I'm going to get home. I'm going to find a flight home. We're going to meet with some doctors. We're going to fix this. Don't worry. At least we know what's going on, and we're going to get this past us and get on with our merry lives. That's kind of how naive we were, as newlyweds, I guess.
And then it was not that easy.
No, he went into surgery about 5 weeks later, and it's funny to think about. The neurosurgeon had given us this pamphlet about the 5 days that we would spend at Emory University Hospital, and fortunately, the doctor that kind of wrote the book on the kind of tumor that Martin had was based right at Emory, and fantastic doctor. We just love him and thank him so much for how well everything did go. But he gave us what the next 5 days would look like. It was brain surgery, 2 days in ICU, a day in a regular room, and then Martin would be discharged. And that isn't exactly what happened. We ended up being in the ICU for about a week and a half, and then discharged to a regular room for about a week. Martin was sent home for about 10 days and then developed some complications. And that's when things kind of really was crazy for a little while. He actually went back to the ICU and was there for 5 weeks. And that's when we spent I don't know, maybe 3 or 4 nights wondering whether he would even wake up the next morning. And after 5 weeks in ICU, went back to a regular room for about a month, and then ended up at an inpatient rehab facility for about a month. It was a long. The whole process was about 3.5 months, and it was a relief when we were finally discharged. But at that point, we could tell that things weren't going to go back to normal. The life we had before, we were so thankful that Martin was still alive and that he was even able to come off machines and be discharged. But I could tell right away that normal, what we had known as normal, was no more.
Right. So, Laura, what did you even do with that? I love that in your book you talk about wrestling with the question of, wait a second, we've been doing all of this for God. Doesn't God owe us something?
Yes. I'd say for us, we faced the 2 main challenges. First of all, there was this logistic challenge. So Martin was discharged, and we were in our probably mid 20s at the time, mid to late 20s, and so I mean, we're just kids. We had no idea what to do. He was discharged. He couldn't even walk, and we were living at the time in a 2nd floor condo in Atlanta, and I remember the doctor discharging him, and I'm thinking, I can't even get this, over 200-pound guy up the steps. I didn't know what I was going to do, not like the rest of my life, but like the next hour. I had no idea, and people from our church came around, and so at first it was just trying to figure out. From Martin's surgery, he no longer had the use of his pituitary gland, and so he had all of this medication he needed to take in order to stay alive. The problem was he had such a short-term memory deficit because of the brain injury that he couldn't remember whether he'd taken medicine. And so literally I remember each day focusing on, how can I keep my husband alive? So that was the one struggle. The other side of it is the one probably that you were more referring to, is that spiritual question of, God, we have believed in you our whole lives, and I still to this very day believe with my whole heart that God is all powerful, that He is all loving, that He is good, that He is perfect in all of His ways. I believe all of that. But how do I reconcile that with the fact that God hasn't brought that healing that we've prayed for? And a lot of it, because of the platform that I've had as a worship leader, we've literally had tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people praying for complete healing for Martin. But for whatever reason, God hasn't answered that prayer in the way that we had anticipated.
I think something that is you touched on in your book as well is that what's sometimes difficult is that He does answer for some people. Some people do pray and they get what they wanted. I had lunch a couple of weeks ago with a girlfriend of mine who went through adultery and went through divorce, just like I did. And then her husband repented and he came back and they got remarried. And I was mad. I was really ticked off about it. Like, what is that all about? And you talk about in your book, and I'd love to hear your story, your retelling of Jesus at Capernaum. Can you tell us about that?
Well, you're talking about the John 9 passage?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting passage. One of the things sometimes I do when I teach is go through just a ton of different pictures in the scriptures of Jesus healing. And one of them would be John 9, where He heals the man born blind and said, but before He even heals it, there's all these people asking, well, why was this guy born blind in the first place? And Jesus doesn't give this clear answer, but the answer He does give is that His works might be displayed, that His glory might be displayed. And it's this real poignant answer, which I think probably was a huge relief to these parents who may have been listening in, or even the man himself, who could have lived for years thinking, God, what did I do to deserve this? What did my parents do to deserve this? Because in that day and age, blindness really was seen as a sin. We didn't there wasn't as much medical prevention as there is in this day and age. So it was, in a lot of ways, it was good to hear a little bit, that God desires, when He does allow sin, to stay in the form of an illness, He really does have a purpose for it, for His glory to be displayed. Another passage I love to touch on is in Mark 1, where Jesus is healing all of these people. And the next day, the disciples come back and say, okay, Jesus, everybody's here. They're ready for your big healing fest to start again. And Jesus' response is, we're going to go to the next town. And I'm going to proclaim my message there because that's what I came for. So it really does beg this question of, okay, if Jesus didn't come to bring complete physical healing to every person, what could be more important? That He would leave behind sick, lame, dying people to go somewhere else. What could this message be that's so important? And the truth is it's a message of spiritual healing. It's a message of spiritual life. And as we go through brokenness, and whether it's illness or mental illness, all sorts of other things in this life, no matter what it is that we go through, we really learn what we believe is most important. As a believer, was my highest goal just to have this comfortable life with all of our health and enough money, to be able to take a family vacation every year? What was my expectation of God? But at the end of the day, asking, but what does God tell us He's going to give us as believers? Well, He doesn't say that it's always going to be comfortable. He says that He's going to, honestly, He says that we're going to have trials, and that those trials will be enough to show us our need for Him. And the things He does promise us, that He'll never leave or forsake us in the midst of it, that He's going to work all things together for good. And I know that there's this tendency of seeing those promises as just Band-Aids for our hurt, and I don't think that that's God's intention. I think His intention is to use His promises to strengthen a people of faith. A lot of times I wonder if I even had faith before all this happened. You know what I mean? It's this question of, I know that I believed all of it, but I don't know if I'd ever walked through something that required me to believe in God's goodness in the face of such badness. Because the very essence of faith really is believing that God is good when we can't see it around us. And so this has definitely been something that has strengthened both mine and my husband's faith.
Of course it has. This is one of my favorite quotes. Our desire is for God to fix broken things, but God's desire is for us to fix our relationship with Him. Just so incredibly powerful. Our motivations are so completely different from what God's are. Let me ask you a question. What is it that you're hoping that people are going to get out of this study? What is your main objective for people to get?
I would say, I feel called to share our story to the extent that it points to His story. Our story in a lot of ways it's a context for the scriptures to come alive, which I believe that about everyone's story. So to the extent that they learn the truth about what God says about suffering, the truth about what God says about prayer and our expectations of Him, and truly how much He loves us, even in the midst of suffering, and how His story is so much bigger than just one individual life. I think that those are all things I hope people gather from and really gain from the study. More than anything, people that are living in what they may perceive as a hopeless situation. I meet countless women and men at all of our live events that talk about the horror that they have gone through. And sometimes there's this tendency to try to minimize their pain, to say, no, it's not that bad. Cheer up, it's going to be good. And I always try to fight that tendency and say, yeah, you're right. What you're walking through is horrific. What that man did to your daughter is horrific. Living with a child with a disability, you wonder how you're going to get through each day. But the truth is that you can find hope and strength and courage and literally that new breath for each day from the person of Jesus Christ. It's not that we hope that Jesus changes our circumstances, even though that's okay, but that's not where our hope lies. Our hope lies in the person of Jesus and believing that he can do extraordinary things beyond what we can even ask or imagine.
Mm-hmm. Laura, so many people are in the middle of hardship right now, and I wanted to ask you, what is the best thing that we can do in those life-altering phone call moments when everything upends in just a moment? What would you say to the person who's listening who is in the middle of that season of just a crisis?
Yeah, I'd say 3 things real quick. First of all, if you haven't come to a place where you've surrendered your life to Jesus, I don't know how anyone walks through trials without believing that their trial finds a greater purpose and a greater story of redemption. So as simple as it may sound, giving your life to Jesus, and maybe you say, oh, I've been a Christian for so long. I hear you, but it's giving your life to Jesus. For me, you can either do this or you can do this with your life, with your greatest trials, and I've spent so many nights doing this, and this is good on some level, but it also doesn't gain any traction. It's relinquishing your life, your trial to the Lord. So that believing the scriptures above what you feel, clinging to those promises of God. And thirdly, having believers that walk through life alongside of you. We were not created to do Christianity as lone rangers, finding a church to plug into, and not just any church, not one of those churches you have to show up with your hair all done perfect in order to fit in. A church full of broken people seeking a gospel transformation together.
I love you share the story of your daughter getting all bloody right before you have leading worship.
I have so many stories of my kids being bloody.
Well, I'm incredibly grateful that you're a very, very real person and are saying, you know what, we can't be anything other than the mess that we are. Yeah. So there's no point in trying to cover it up or be perfect or gloss over the top of it. It doesn't work that way. So thank you for being a real person that way.
Well, thank you for saying that. I am a mom of 3 little ones, and we travel around doing ministry together, and it's very different than the life that I envisioned for myself. And I talk about that a lot in the book. It has been a really sweet journey of our family being on mission together for the cause of Christ. And a lot of it is just accepting the story that God is writing for my life. Even though it may look very different, even though some chapters have looked very different than what I expected, I could literally waste away my life bitter over this thing happening, or this not looking like I thought it should. Or I can really embrace that God's writing a different story than what I expected, and say, okay, God, I'm just gonna hand it over to you. Show me how you are going to use even the most broken chapters of my story to make much of yourself.
And that's really what it comes down to, which you talk about in your book, which I so appreciate. It's an issue of God saying to us, do you trust me or do you not?
Absolutely.
Because your story hasn't gone the way that you would have written it. My story hasn't gone the way I would have written it. But God's trustworthy, and he takes those horrible situations and turns them into blessings. And so I'm going to ask you a question, Laura, my friend. Will you please sing a little bit, just a chorus maybe, of your song Blessings, and I'm going to be all verklempt over here while you do it.
Okay, absolutely, I would love to. What if your blessings come through raindrops? What if your healing comes through tears? And what if 1,000 sleepless nights are what it takes to know your need? And what if trials of this kind are your mercies in disguise?
Thank you so much. Personal concert, I just completely love it. Okay, everybody, if you haven't signed up for the online Bible study, you can do that today. Also, if you haven't registered, go ahead and do that. If you haven't gotten your resources, go to store.faithgateway.com and use the code LAURA4 to save $4 off the book, study guide, or the DVD with that coupon code LAURA4. Laura, we have absolutely loved being with you today. Is there any final thoughts that you want to leave with our listeners?
I do. Lori, I want to thank you for letting me be part of what you guys at Faith Gateway are doing. Women studying the Word. If you were to ask me what is the one thing that's gotten me through, it's the promises of God and believing that they're true, not just for these mountaintop days, but for the valleys. And it's the time that we as women spend in the Word. That is what changes us, even when our circumstances aren't changing. So I would say, get plugged in with this study, and not because it's my study. I would say if any Bible study, we believe that the Word of God doesn't return void, that it's sharper than any two-edged sword. And I believe that through us studying the Word, it's not just that our lives are transformed, our marriages are transformed, our families, our communities, through the time that we spend sitting at the feet of Jesus, asking Him to change us.
Thank you so much, Laura. Guys, go get your materials today. The book is fantastic. You're really going to love it. Laura, thank you so much for being with us. We just appreciate you, and we're so looking forward to starting the study.
Hey, thanks so much. Have a great day.
God bless everybody.